You're listening to Body Banter, a podcast where we have conversations about the human body in all its forms and from as many perspectives we can find.
We are your hosts, Shagun Yedele
and Claudia Krebs.
And we are professors of anatomy in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada.
Anatomy is for everybody and every body, and we're here to get the body banter going.
We hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Body Banter. My name is Shagun Yedele, and I am speaking today from Kelowna, which is in the traditional unceded territories of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. And as usual, I have Claudia. Hi, Claudia.
Hi, Shagun. So good to be here with you. I'm joining you from Vancouver on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. We have a really interesting guest here today. So thrilled to have Blake McCabe join us. Hi, Blake. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Blake McCabe. I am a drag performer and costume designer who resides in the small town of Port Angeles, Washington, which is the ferry port just across from Victoria on Vancouver Island. I do a lot of performance throughout Washington State here and there, primarily Seattle being the most common city that I perform in. And I got my fashion design degree from Art Institute of Seattle back in 2014. And since then, I have been primarily making costumes for drag performers.
Wow, that is so cool. So you have this very unique experience of your own body and of the bodies that you dress. Maybe we can start with your own experience of what it is like to get into drag and how that changes your own experience of your body.
Yeah, so there's a lot of body manipulation that essentially you do in order to get a more feminine presenting physique when you want to get on stage. Of course, now I do want to at least put at ease on the subject of, all drag is valid. And a lot of people like to do a good gender freak sort of aesthetic where they might not wear hip padding. But for my own personal drag persona, I tend to do the hip padding and then at least 3 to 4, if not 5 layers of tights, and then maybe fishnets on top of that with a slight body shaper. And then, of course, padded brawing, or even what's known as a breastplate, which is like a silicone piece that allows better movement from, the breast itself when you're moving on stage or hopping around or whatever you might be doing on stage. And so it is certainly a process because, of course, there's the tucking process that a lot of queens will go through. And some have different ways of approaching it, especially if they don't intend on wearing layering. But luckily for me, because I wear those several layers, you just kind of get things situated as far as, my genitalia goes. And then from there, all the layers that we have on kind of smooths things out. And just a joke that we always call it, we have Barbie crotch and Muppet butt, just a funny terms that we like to call it. And so, like I said, there's a lot of body manipulation that you're doing so that you have a more feminine presenting. Because, as far as I go, I don't work out, but I have some decent arms for as far as a male presenting person tends to go for most of the time in the day. And so trying to convince people I'm a Marilyn Monroe with beefcake arms can be a little bit of a struggle. So I just try to make sure that with all the padding and stuff, I have a more feminine presenting persona when it comes to stage. And along with a lot of my drag family goes, they also do the same. But, that with that, though, sometimes there's things that I have to do in my costume designs where I can hide those features every now and then. And sometimes, if somebody's just not a fan of their arms or their you know, like their arms or shoulders. Usually I might use a fabric that's known as a nude mesh that has like a nice tone that matches their skin as best as possible, especially on stage. And, you know, I might incorporate that into design. So instead of them having their actual skin showing, it would just be like a nude mesh, which is why it's always so comical about, you know, a lot of the debate that's going on about drag queens being showing off too much skin, because there's a lot of us who have way more layers than anyone can even contemplate, that by the time we get all those layers off, we're just ready to crash in bed.
Yeah,
So,
that's really interesting to me, Blake. And what stood out to me was that there's, you know, even among the drag family, there's not a uniformity, or there's just not a, like some people, like you said, use some padding, other people don't like to use padding. And that's really fascinating to me, because one of the things that we teach our students is just that there's no uniform body. Everyone is different and everyone has different preferences and so on. Can you speak to that in the sense that, you know, it doesn't make you less you if you prefer one way versus another way of presenting?
yeah, there's that's why I made sure I made the statement of all drag is valid, because, you know, for the longest time there's always just been the two definitions of drag queen or drag king, and so therefore it narrows the gender spectrum. But nowadays we like to say drag artists, because there are people out there, you know, not everyone wants to spend, you know, 15 to 20 minutes putting on all those layers. And let me tell you, putting on all those kind of layers when it comes to summertime drag, you know, that's like a moment where we start to rethink ourselves for a moment. But we, at least vast majority of people in my drag family, that's usually our usual aesthetic, which is to put on all those layers and have a more female impersonating drag persona. But there's plenty of people out there, as I've said, who like to do the gender freak sort of construct, where, you know, you will see performers who might have a like feminine shaped body, but they still have like facial hair or a mustache, and then like their own hair versus a giant glamorous wig. It just, you know, it really depends on each individual and drag artist where they want to play around with things, which you know, I personally do find that great. You know, the whole gender argument starts to become silly, because sometimes there are bodies out there that have a little more testosterone or estrogen. And so therefore we're just like that kind of community of people that are there, where it's like, who cares, be yourself and, you know, have fun. And that's what a lot of us do. And we're totally fine with that.
It sounds so liberating, right? Like you have this wide open spectrum of performance and presentations, and it really depends on the individual's preferences, how they want to present and which persona they have on stage. When you put on your layers, as you call them, the padding, the breast plate, the various layers of tights, the tucking, how does that change your own experience of your own body? We know that we have sort of a schema of ourselves, right? Like in our brain, how we present to the world and how we experience our body. And we know that that sort of proprioception of ourselves in this space we take up changes with our clothing. So we know that folks who wear big hats tend to need bigger space, because that hat becomes part of their sort of body space. This is very specific, right? Like you are putting on layers and padding to change your gender presentation. How does that change your experience of yourself?
So it's very common for a lot of drag artists where they have a different persona that they present, especially when they put on all of the makeup and layers and such. For a lot of them, a different level of confidence comes out for sure. I mean, the same could be said. I definitely have a level of confidence. I still like to think in general, I am still fairly the same person, because for me, I actually still use the same name, you know, my biological name, for my drag, because so then, it's also a marketing technique, so that when people hear my name, they're like, oh, the costume designer. Or if they hear me as a costume designer, they're, oh, the drag artist. They just tie one in the same. Where there's a lot of other people have a different name for their drag, and then they have their, as we call it, their government name. And the history of that is that people actually used different names in the past because of, as some may know, just being gay in general was a crime in the 50s and 60s. And so a lot of these men were actually dressing up in drag so that they could get away with being with each other in public, or even get into bars and not be stopped by police officers and such. And of course, as times progressed, it turned into it went from being a lifestyle secrecy to becoming a performance art. And I mean, drag even goes as far back as ancient Greece, where the men did dress in drag because, unfortunately, women weren't allowed to perform on stage. And so it was all men who were doing that. And then, of course, that carried on up into Shakespearean times, where it was only men on stage performing and they were dressing in drag. But with that, it could easily be said that those actors themselves had to invest in their part and feel as though they were truly a woman, and portrayed that as best as they could on stage. So with that, that's just a lot of the same thing that happens with drag. You put on at least hour and a half to 2 hours worth of makeup, depending on how long you've been doing it, and then you put on all the layers, the costume, the heels, and it's a whole new ball game. Because on the mic, when I'm in drag, it's like I'm witty, I'm nonstop, and I can do that with just about any stranger in the crowd. But when I was working at my regular job, and some guy sits at the bar and he's like, oh, you got any jokes? And I was completely floored and stumped right then and there. I was like, wow, I don't know any jokes right now, because you just asked for them and I'm just standing here as a bartender and a guy. But in drag, it would have just, would have been right on that point. And I think there's always a different level of confidence that takes over us once we put on all that drag. Perhaps it's because I think a lot of queens were just inspired by powerful female role leaders in their lives, where a lot of times it was their mother, or it could have been some aunt, their grandmother, their sister, who knows, along with even just powerful individuals out there. Because a good example is, I actually do like to use my own hair for drag every now and then, and I usually tend to have, as some of my friends call Ken doll hair. It's thicker and has plenty of volume, so it looks well on stage. But there's also other times where I put on a giant wig. But the reason I enjoy having a sort of short hair style and aesthetic when it's on stage is because my mom rocked short hair a lot in the 90s. But my mom's hairstyle was influenced by Princess Diana, who is also another very inspiring person for me as far as drag goes. So having shorter hair is something that I like to do every now and then with my drag, because a lot of women might know men are always like, oh, I like you with your hair down and long. And so, to have short hair for a more androgynous look is rebelling against gender expectations in general. And so you just feel a different level of power when you put on all that stuff, despite, you still being true to yourself. There's just still a little bit of confidential influence upon one's personality and persona when all that stuff comes on, because you're a different level of beauty. Once we put on drag, it's like, then we can really feel that feminine side and experience a different part of the world.
Yeah, that's fascinating, Blake. Which brings me to your fashion design work, because it's a huge part of you. It's a huge part of what you do. and I went to your website, and it's fascinating. All
It's a little messy.
the bold and beautiful colors, and so I guess my question is, and I think you sort of got into it, how that fashion, the expression of fashion, how that intersects with your performance as an artist, as a drag artist, and maybe for yourself and for others in the drag family. What does, do people first of all get to choose their costumes, or do you design specifically with people in mind? And if so, how does that intersect? Does that say something about who they are and how they express themselves?
So it really depends on the client, and if there's anything I've learned about myself, because this is something I studied, and like, for example, I technically have three jobs. And costume design is the one I consider my professional job. Is it the job that I'm doing all the time? No, but I don't want to do this job all the time, or I'll start to grow tired of it. I want to still maintain that passion and love I have for it. And the best way I've personally been able to maintain that passion and love is when I actually just get to have creative freedom. And, one of my most favorite sayings from the Dom Perignon ad with featuring Lady Gaga is the slogan was creative freedom is power. And I am a firm believer of that. And a lot of times, especially people in my drag family, they have the confidence and faith in me to create something for them that they definitely know by now, especially after 10 years of making things for them, that I'm going to do my job and make sure that they look great. Is there mistakes along the way? Absolutely. But because then I've had clients where they don't really want me as a fashion designer. They just want me to be their sewing assistant. And let me tell you, all those times that's happened, it's never been a good work between the two of us. Because at that point, I just, it's that one point where I don't let down on the control of it. Because, a lot of times they're speaking from a place of no experience in it. Whereas I'm like, well, this is what I do. And ironically, I've had drag queen clients are like the easiest to work with because they want outlandish. They want something that's influential and out there, and they're gonna love it. Whereas I've had, a very small amount of female clients who at that point, and I get it because of how society is, a lot of them have way less confidence. And so therefore they have way more picky things to pick at when it comes to making things for them. So they tend to be a little more high maintenance for my taste in making. And so as far as that own individual's confidence goes, sometimes I will be like, well, how about you find images on the internet of what silhouettes and things you like? Because then, I can work with that as far as making sure that they still feel confident and good looking in their design. Drag queen costumes is just more fun than fashion will ever be. While I do have a degree in fashion, costumes is just where it's fun, and there's way less limits and restrictions.
That's so cool. And I like this idea of being outlandish and big in the costumes, right? Dressing somebody in a way that pushes all the boundaries. That must be so satisfying for you to design for and to dress for. When we're looking at, like you talked a lot about the padding and sort of the modifications that happen to a body. How do you account for that as you are creating the costumes? Because you have a male presenting body, typically under masculinizing hormonal influence.
Yes.
And so with that, there comes a question of muscle mass, a question of sort of shoulder dimensions, hip dimensions. And then you have to create a costume that accounts for padding to change that while still having that body underneath the padding. Just asking the question is kind of breaking my brain. So how do you account for that?
It's funny because when you do think about that, it's, your mind is going to go like, how the heck do you do all that? It actually, I've simplified it over the years. Like classic patterning as far as design goes. Usually it's somebody taking measurements and then sitting with graphing paper and doing the ruler and all that stuff. Nowadays, where it's a little more easier to do, especially with the existence of stretch fabrics, which is all of us drag queens favorites is stretch fabrics anyways, more sporty and performing arts fabrics. A lot of the times I can just use like a standard pattern that I have that fits a wide range of people because I'm using stretch fabric. Now, as if it's like non-stretch fabric, I do have to be more precise in my work. And with that, instead of just doing measurements of people, I actually it's a fun process, especially if they're a new client, but I actually will just wrap them in saran wrap and then masking tape on top of that, usually just like the torso down to the hip level, maybe a little bit past the crotch area. And then I'll draw the pattern and seam lines on said masking tape. So it'd almost be like I'm taking their body and turning it into a slight dress form. And then I just cut that off of them, and it's almost like a cocoon of that person's body, a sculpting of their body per se. And then I'm able to just transfer that onto paper. And then I might, if I'm looking at images of design inspiration, I will make sure to try to draw the seam lines in the right and correct place for that specific design look on their body and where it'll hit. And then I, kind of go on from there. And then you take it. So you go from 3D to 2D, back to 2D again, because you do the 2D pattern making and then 2D fabric, and then you turn it into 3D again. And so fabric definitely has a huge influence on it though. Like spandex is the easiest thing you can do. You can have less seams and it'll fit like a glove and really well and look good. Whereas, like I said, non-stretch fabrics, that's where you have to that's where a lot more customization goes. And not very often do a lot of people want non-stretch to begin with anyways. If they do get non-stretch, odds are it's going to be like a really oversized big layer over them that they might wear as a coat or a flowy tearaway. So again, I like fabric is definitely the biggest influence. And then I try to get body sculptings of certain clients, especially if it's a new client that has more different body type. But for my drag family and the patterns that I have, I've obviously, since I've been working with them for 10 years, I'm able to make anything that's stretched is most likely going to fit them. Sometimes, one of them might have a little bit bigger shoulders, but I usually take that in account. And then while I'm cutting it out in the fabric, I might add a little extra room here and there myself.
Excellent. I like this behind the scenes tour that you've given us here. It's really fascinating, and thank you for sharing that. So as we have to wrap up our discussion, Blake, and so I want to start out by saying now you work with different body dimensions, different body types, and so on, and your own experience about your body. We've asked that question. So, and we are scientists, we are anatomists, and we always like to ask this question from our guests. Do you have a favorite body part?
The waist.
Always.
I love the waist.
Oh, the waist.
The waist is, I love a good waist, and for a very wide range of reasons that I don't have to get into, but I just love the waist in general. And just when it comes to design, it's the waist, and the waist, generally speaking, is always the smallest part of the torso on the average body. And that's just always like my favorite spot because, and most of the time, because drag queens do padding, it's like the waist is where the design comes in. And depending on the fabric itself, like if it has a print, or like pinstripe suits always look good on gentlemen because you have the lines coming in at the waist and then expanding back out towards the hips and butt area. You are correct. Hips don't lie. They never do. So the waist is just like the most accentuated part of the torso that I enjoy a lot.
That was maybe our most rapid response to this question ever. And so cool to put it onto the waist. And it's nice from an anatomical perspective, right? Like when you think of the waist as that transition between the torso and then the hips and the lower limb, it is a very exciting area of the body. So with that being your favorite body part, what is your least favorite body part?
Arms. arms are
Arms.
arms can be the worst because, just like sleeves are just such a pain. That's usually the biggest struggle is arms because again, sleeves, you could have a design look great, and then especially in non-stretch fabrics, and then once the person tries it on, it's like, oh, where are they having struggle at? The arms. Because especially in a lot of jackets and designs and stuff, it's like with how much range and movement the arms have in general, because you move your arms back, the chest expands, but if you move your arms forward, the back expands, and so the arms have so much influence and effect on the shaping of things. Because I'm sure we've all once in our life, oh, this shirt fits great, and then once you get past the waist towards the chest, it's like, okay, a little tight, and then what do? You move your arms back, and then the buttons are holding on for dear life, and that's because of the arms. It's not because of the chest, it's because of the arms moving, and that's just what the body does. And expansion is like just the biggest struggle when it comes to making things. When we as humans sit, the hips expand outwards a little bit, so you always want to make sure like there's some room in the seams, the side seams and stuff, so that which is a term we call ease. We want ease in our design, so that when you do sit, there's ease in the design itself, so that the hips can expand comfortably. No one's going to stop their hips from expanding when it comes to sitting. But yeah, just when it comes to arms, sleeves can be such a pain. And of course, there's just sometimes I'm able to make sleeve designs where that's not a big deal. But if you want a more fitted sleeve, then, the more fit the sleeve, the more high the struggle might be as far as that goes. So ironically, it's arms. As much as I utilize my arms in my craft and everything I do every day, and I am thankful to have both of them, they're still a pain in the butt.
I would agree that they are maybe the most difficult part of the body to dress. As you were talking, I took a tour through my closet, going through my favorite and least favorite shirts. And it has nothing to do with the aesthetic of the shirt. It has to do with the fit and the mobility that I have in them. So yes, absolutely. I can totally see how you would see the arms as a least favorite body part. I knit, and all knitters have this thing when they're knitting a sweater or cardigan. We call it Sleeve Island. So we love knitting everything else, and then it comes to knitting the sleeves, and we just kind of sit there and don't finish.
Yep,
anyway,
that's hemlines for me sometimes. Like when I'll like finish a design near the end, and then there's the hem, and I'm like, God, I've looked at this design for so long, and now I have to hem it.
Yep. Okay. So it's that. Yes. I can totally see the hem being another island that a creator would be on. Blake, it has been absolutely fascinating to speak to you and to get that behind the scenes look, as Shagan was saying, to your creative process and how you dress this diversity of bodies. Thank you so much for sharing those details with us. It's been a learning experience and an absolutely wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. My first podcast.
Yay. I'm glad that it was with us. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Body Banter.
We are Claudia
and Shagun,
and we look forward to having you join us for more conversations about the human body next time.